Hello and welcome to the U.S. Center at COP28. My name is Emily McAuliffe and I'm the Deputy Director for Public Engagement at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. I'll be one of your MCs for the next 2 weeks, so you'll be seeing me a lot. Welcome to our second event, Strengthening Public, Private, and Philanthropic Collaboration to Halt Commodity-Driven Deforestation. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage Jack Hurd, Executive Director for the Tropical Forest Alliance.
Hi, good morning. Morning, everybody. Good morning for those of you on the live stream as well. And we're happy to be here today. So, as mentioned, my name is Jack Hurd. I'm the Executive Director of the Tropical Forest Alliance, and I run the nature work at the World Economic Forum. And so I'm really happy to be here today. I've got 3 panelists with me. So Eileen Lee is the head of programs at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Rick Duke is the Deputy Special Presidential Envoy for Climate with the U.S. government. Marcelo Brito is the Executive Secretary of the Interstate Consortium for the Legal Amazon in Brazil. We have a 4th panelist who is stuck in the queue, and she will be here momentarily or within the hour. We'll leave it at that, okay? So what we're going to do today is I'm going to say a few words about the issue we're trying to address here, and then we're going to get into some immediate questions and answers and some discussions, and then we'll go to see if people have questions from the floor, and then we'll wrap up in exactly at the, I guess it's the bottom of the next hour. So that's the plan of attack. So a couple things from me first off. By the way, I apologize. I want to thank the U.S. Center for organizing this for us. This is great. It's a really nice space, beautifully organized, nice and cool and quiet. So we'll take that as a really positive sign right off the bat. So thank you, the U.S. government, the U.S. Center Dubai, for putting this together. Okay, a couple things. The IPCC says very clearly that in order to meet our 1.5 degree target, we need to end deforestation, and we need to end the conversion of natural ecosystems by 2030 with significant progress by 2025. And this is because deforestation and associated land use change generates somewhere between 12 and 20% of CO2 emissions. So that's a substantial bit of an impact. One of the key drivers to this deforestation and ecosystem conversion is the expansion of agricultural commodities into natural landscapes. And that is primarily associated with timber. It's primarily associated with timber and palm oil and soy and cattle. And there's a few other commodities that have a role in that process too, cacao, coffee, rubber, etc. Okay, but we've got 3 or 4 big commodities that are driving things here. I guess in order to then move away from this issue of extensive commodity production, we've got to come up with a different sort of agricultural model, or an agricultural production model. And that is more intensive, utilizing the land that's already been cleared and trying to add some different components to that to make it more regenerative and take better care of the soil conditions, take better care of the watering and associated aspects of that. Okay, so that's sort of the challenge at hand, is how do we sort of move in that direction from an extensive model of agricultural production to something that's more intensive. And there's a few different actors who have different roles to play in that space. So we know that corporations have a large role to play in influencing and informing what happens with producers on the ground, and so movement towards a more open and nature positive approach to agriculture is going to be the direction that they need to travel in. And that it has to do with setting targets around dependencies and impacts on nature, developing management plans to move in that direction. Governments have a really important role to play, both in producer countries as well as in consumer countries. In the producer countries, it's putting in place the financial and policy incentives to drive the transition. In the consumer countries, it's about trying to figure out what are the types of development partnerships that can be put in place to help underwrite the cost of that transition or to incentivize that transition in other ways. I think the financial world has a big role to play. On one end of the spectrum, there's philanthropic resources that can really reduce risk and be early investors in innovative ideas and sort of blend things in where they need to be blended in. The other end of the spectrum is straight up commercial investment, where banks and others are looking for an appropriate risk-adjusted rate of return on that investment. And there's a lot of stuff in the middle. There's concessional capital, there's impact investing and things like that. And finally, we've got civil society organizations who are deeply involved in channeling voices into the conversation, developing analytical products, decision support tools, and things like that. So there's a lot of room for everybody in this space. And our challenge is to try to figure out how do we pull that all together. So we've got three panelists. I think I see Allison in the wings, so let's invite Allison in right on time. Perfect, Allison. Hi. Welcome. So Allison has been through the gauntlet of the access process, so we'll let her calm down for a bit and just relax and welcome her. So we're going to jump right into it. I want to start with Marcelo. And Marcelo has spent his career working at this interface of agriculture and nature in Brazil. And so, Marcelo, you've seen the issue of agriculture commodity production up close for a number of years. You've seen changes, you see challenges, you see opportunities. I wonder if you could just spend a few minutes and tell us, what do you see from the perspective of Brazil, the changes that have happened in the last several years, and what are the challenges and opportunities that you see going forward?
Well, good morning, everyone. Jack, thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks the U.S. Center to have us here. Well, Jack, my first COP, it was a biodiversity COP, was in 2006. So I have been around for quite some time. I have been traveling all over the world and talking about climate change and agricultural processes and challenges and development and so on. What's the difference from 20 years ago and now? Now we're talking about the cost of scarcity. That's the real thing, is the cost of scarcity. We are running out of water, we are running out of forests, and this has deep social impacts, especially in developing countries like Brazil. When you look at tropical forest deforestation, and doesn't matter if it's Brazil or Indonesia or Malaysia or the Congo basin. When you look at the path, it's almost the same. You have like 1/3 of the deforestation that is done by local communities, settlements, smallholders, indigenous communities, and so on. This is 1/3 of the deforestation. The other 2/3 come from land grabbing. And why land grabbing? Because it's the cost opportunity. The cost of land, because of the scarcity, is going up. If I ask you, do you believe that in 20 years' time the cost of land will be higher or lower than today? It's going to be higher. So land grabbing, it's 1/3 of this deforestation. The other 1/3 is private owners. Okay? To prevent deforestation from big companies is easy. You can map them. You have the satellites. You can watch them and see what's going around. They are big. They're huge. Look into the Brazilian Amazon. We have like 600,000 smallholders. 600,000 smallholders. There's no way to map them. You have the satellite image, but you cannot point it out who are them. They own 5 hectares, 10 hectares. They use the land for their living. They're not producing soybeans, corn, cotton, or exported commodities. They're producing their local foods. They're poor people. How do you tackle this? I've been working with several NGOs for a long time. I am in the board of big ones. And they tend to forget that there are deforestation coming from those guys. Because it's very hard to tackle poverty, misery, and hunger. This is terrible. So I believe we're coming to the right place right now and to the right and setting the right target right now, because we're not talking the simple thing of deforestation, but the impact of that, but without forgetting that deforestation is about 20% of the whole issue, 80% is energy, transportation, and the industrial sector. And for the first time in my life, I believe that we are running in a good way. But remember, at the same time that we put a lot of critics and command and control against land grabbing in Brazil, we have to look at the big countries worldwide and ask if they are not doing planet grabbing when they not decide to reduce emissions, when they continue to pollute, and when they run away to set a carbon price. If we don't have a carbon price, we're not going to change behaviors. Humans are very difficult to change. So this is a planet grabbing. You're grabbing part of my air, part of my oxygen, and I'm in the southern hemisphere, and I cannot scream for you to listen to me. So I think it's right away to beginning is that.
That's great. Thanks very much, Marcelo. I think this idea of difficult to tackle poverty, misery, and hunger lies at the core of part of this issue. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. So, Rick, I'd like to move over to you. Now, the U.S. government has commercial partnerships with lots of countries around the world. It has development partnerships with numbers of countries around the world. And the U.S. government has made big commitments around climate, around nature, around sustainable development. So how do you see the U.S. government engaging in this issue around commodity-driven deforestation, or the issues that Marcelo has talked about, poverty, misery, and hunger? And what do you see the role that the U.S. government can play in this space?
Yeah, thank you. And let me just start with a bit of overarching context, which is I work for John Kerry, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, and when we think about keeping a safer 1.5 degree centigrade future within reach, there are three big things on the to-do list. Of course, energy transition globally by 2050 to net zero energy. But the second is ending deforestation as the world called for in the Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use Change at COP26 2 years ago. That's what we're talking about here today. The third, though, is cutting non-CO2 superpollutants, centrally methane. And we're also talking about that today. And I want to kind of weave those two things together, because by addressing commodity-driven deforestation in a strategic way, we actually are, at the heart of it, increasing agricultural productivity, livestock, dairy productivity, which sometimes can be factor of 5, factor of 10 higher with the right attention, with the right way to invest in rural smallholder agriculture and livestock management, agroforestry, and the whole range of things. And when you do that, you not only relieve pressure on land prices, land conversion, deforestation, conversion of the Cerrado and other biomes, you also proportionately cut methane emissions. So you're getting at two of the three big things we need to do to keep 1.5C within reach. Now, it's also then a positive economic story by definition, because if you are investing to encourage these smaller holders to have the inputs they need, the animal husbandry they need, the nutrition they need to have more productive output per hectare, then that's good all around. Not easy, but essential. What we see then on the large scale agriculture is an opportunity to put in place the systems that will allow traceability of cattle, to make sure that we know which cattle is coming from where. And I was thrilled yesterday to be joining the governor of Pará in Brazil in announcing 100% traceability as their new commitment in just short order in Pará, a state which has more livestock than all of the United States, I'm told. So this is a really big step. It's indicative of what Brazil is doing. You see that kind of leadership in Brazil starting to make a difference, with deforestation rates down materially in the last year in Brazil. We also see progress in Indonesia, and we're hard at work in DRC as the third major basin. And so there's much to do, but we are working with both scales, the large scale on things like traceability and on the zero conversion commitments that ADM and Cargill have just made, which addresses not just a question of forest conversion, but also other biomes like Cerrado conversion, and then on these issues of traceability and getting the market signals in place for the large scale, but also in parallel, really trying to lift up the productivity of especially smallholder agriculture and livestock so that you get that dual benefit of intensification of production and with that reduced pressure on land use conversion and even a methane benefit on top of that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Rick. I appreciate the tripartite approach there and how you see the synergies between those. I'm going to come back in a little bit to to those zero conversion commitments with ADM and the Cargill and others have been making recently when we get to Allison. Eileen, so the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation and the Conservation Markets Initiative has been active in this space for a number of years, specifically in Brazil. I'm just sort of curious as to how you see the role of philanthropy, both what you've done in the past, but maybe equally importantly, how you see the role of philanthropy going forward in this space.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think I like to think of the role of philanthropy as helping to optimize the flow of capital without subsidizing, right? And it's interesting, both Marcelo, you talked about the cost of scarcity, that there's a real cost to these practices not working today. And Rick, you talked about a positive economic story by definition coming from investment in these smallholders. And yet it isn't really happening, right? And I think when it comes down to it, it comes down to it is the hard stuff. It's the stuff that requires collective action, right? It's not something that's within the power of any one actor in the supply chain, one sector in the supply chain to be able to make these things come together. And for me, when I think about philanthropy, because we have the luxury of longer time horizons, more risk to our capital, that's really where we can play to greatest effect. If I think about the things that we've invested in the past that are also going to be the foundation, I think, for where we can be helpful to solutions going forward, a lot of times it's about infrastructure, right? Whether it's the data, the tools, the pieces that, again, no one player can really carry, but that with some support from philanthropic capital working with other partners, we can invest enough in having what we need to make a difference. Jack, you talked a little bit about the role of philanthropy as a kind of catalytic capital. I think a lot of attention goes to blended capital models, which makes sense, right? There's an important role for that. But I would also say that a lot of times philanthropic capital can catalyze more in bringing a solution space together in ways that puts the parts together such that public, private, and philanthropic money can flow in concert, right? So we've been talking a lot today about what it's going to take to incentivize the reuse of degraded land and investment in small producers. And I think that's the kind of solution where if we can create the space for parties to come together, we can really make a much bigger difference. The last piece that I would say that maybe philanthropy is a little bit different is policy coherence is going to be a big part of making this work. And in some respects, what we can also do is play in the space of what are the policy changes that need to happen alongside the work that others are doing here to really create space for the solutions we need.
Yeah, super. Thanks very much, Eileen. I think, this idea of, I like the language around the solution space and the infrastructure to sort of support this. Collaboration does not come easily. It does not come cheaply either, right? And so we know that we have to be putting in place the types of processes that allow people to come together and to collaborate and to try to find those solutions to the challenges that do exist. Allison, ADM is a large company, works in a lot of places around the world very successfully, and congratulations, by the way, on the recent announcement about the anti-conversion commitment. So you're in the business of working with farmers and bringing commodities to the global marketplace. That's my words, not yours, obviously. I'm sure ADM has a much more elegant way of describing that. But I'm interested in what you see as the challenges that you've had to overcome as a business to sort of adapt your business model to sort of maybe a changing global context, and where you see the opportunities, the business opportunities for you as a for-profit company in this new global context. Thanks.
Thanks, Jack. Well, for eloquence, we unlock the power of nature to enrich lives. How's that? Which is an important way of saying we're a company that depends on nature. So conserving nature, preserving nature, enhancing soil health, all of this has to do with our business. It's really a seamless cause. I think that the no conversion commitments that you're seeing from companies like ours, although we have studied this and we have looked into how we can define native vegetation, not every farmer knows exactly what that means. There are many different interpretations, even different interpretations of forest. So coming together as a sector so that we can have a common definition, that's been very important. And the collaboration along the lines of everyone's talking here, but also in the entire agriculture value chain is also very important. The key player missing from this discussion right now is the farmer. And in order for us to be successful in these commitments that we've made, which we are implementing now in the 24-25 harvest season, which is now, in order for us to be successful, we have to have collaboration and we have to have a really clear understanding with the farmer. We do a lot of talking about farmers and at farmers, but not enough with farmers. And so that's now the job of a company like ours that interfaces directly with farmers to engage them, to explain these definitions, to explain our sourcing policies and why we have them. But just explanation and engagement, I think, is not enough. So we found that there's some powerful incentives when we work in regenerative agriculture practices, for instance. We're able to not only engage farmers about what that means, we're able to measure the outcomes of these practices, sequestration of carbon in soils, saving water, less inputs, etc. But we also need to provide incentives financially for farmers because these practice changes cost money. If we're asking them to set aside some of their property for conservation purposes, so they're not going to be planting that, they're not going to be making money, they need financial incentives to do that. If we're asking them to change practices, cover crops cost money, for instance, they need financial help to do that. So engaging the entire value chain, philanthropy, governments, investors, and our customers is a very important way for us to work. We need legal standards that are maybe more comprehensive than we have now. The Brazilian Forest Code is a great model. Enforcing that or providing registration for farmers that's digitally available to us so we can see what's happening on that farm more easily would be very helpful to all of us. And other countries having that same kind of legal standard. There needs to be a global understanding of native vegetation conversion and deforestation so that some countries that are buying products from countries that have deforestation risks are cognizant of those risks and sourcing accordingly, whereas others are, some aren't. There's really not a global understanding just yet and harmonization of standards and requirements. Public data is helpful for us to know where indigenous properties are located, which is mapped in Brazil, for instance. It's very helpful to our sourcing. We can literally pull that up on an iPad, look at a farm boundary, utilize satellite imagery, and learn what's happening on a farm and avoid sourcing or engage a farmer. That's actually how we're doing this now. But we need those kinds of tools, and more companies like ours need those kinds of tools. Farmers also need some sort of medium and long-term financial incentives for putting practices in place. We can provide premiums if the market is actually willing to pay a higher price for deforestation and conversion-free product. But that's probably not a sustainable model. So we need to have cooperation along the value chain so that there can be some low interest rates or long-term and medium-term financing for farmers to be able to deploy these practices. And I'll just say, finally, something that Secretary Blinken from the United States talked about yesterday, the vision for adapted crops and soils, VACs. This is a program that is really geared toward helping farmers to understand practices that are better for the soils, better for sequestration of carbon, avoiding conversion, avoiding deforestation, really engaging farmers large and small, but particularly the smallholders. Countries are coming in, nonprofits are coming in, and for-profit corporations are coming in to support VACs. And this is a great example of how we can scale this program up, deploy financial incentives, and deploy a greater understanding internationally.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Allison. You know, I think this, you've said it a couple of times here, this concept of incentives. And, you know, when we talk about the type of transition that we need to bring about here, a transition has sort of two components. There's things you must do, the command and control elements, you know, following the forest code in country X versus country Y. But then there's also the notion of policy and financial incentives that sort of encourage people to do a certain set of things and discourage people from doing a second set of things. And so I want to try to focus on this issue of incentives for a moment. And I'm just going to address this question to whoever wants to take the first crack at answering it. But when we think about financial incentives, everybody always starts with the question like, well, we need more money because we need to have more financial incentives to do A, B, and C. The question that always comes up for me is, well, where's that money going to come from, and what are the mechanisms to bring that money into a space so that a producer or some actor on the value chain can start changing her or his behaviors? So I wonder if anybody wants to take a first crack at sort of how do we think about the financing of incentives that need to be brought to bear if we're trying to underwrite a change in the agriculture model. Do I have any takers on the first one who wants to try to answer this? Okay, let's go with Marcelo and then Allison, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. I can take on that. We've been struggling with premiums and incentives and so on for quite some time. But people, I think, most of the people cannot understand what kind of level of incentive we're talking about. Let's look at the cocoa producers in Brazil. We have 87,000 cocoa farms in Brazil. Okay? 85% of them never had access to financing, bank loans. 85% of them. How can you expect to have intensive production, better yields, quality, and so on, if they even don't have the most basic access to financing? And there are people talking about, well, we have to give them the power to change their behavior, to implement regenerative agriculture, to bring agri-forest system, but they don't have the simple basic access to financing. If we go to other Latin American countries, it's even worse. If you go to Africa and some parts of Asia, it's even worse. So come on, guys. There are two sets of targets here. The big companies, we can split them in those that we call hard to abate. So it's especially the agriculture sector and the mining sector, they are hard to abate. It's hard to convince them. They will become costly to abate in some time. They will have to change. But with those small guys, when we talk about financial incentives, we got to understand where do we start and how long is the journey that we have to set.
You know, it's really interesting. Thanks for that, Marcelo. Often in these conversations, we use the phrase innovative finance. But what you're talking about is just basic finance, right? How do we get the 85% of the coffee farmers access to bank credit? Yeah, cocoa farmers, excuse me. Allison, and then Rick. That's okay.
I very much agree with comments about how to provide basic financing access. We've certainly seen those barriers as well, so I won't repeat that. What we've seen in the U.S. with the Climate Smart Agriculture Program, it's a grant program, so this is a model that other governments could follow as well. grants are being given by the government for agriculture projects. Groups or partners of applicants have come together to apply for this funding, and the majority of the funding will be going to farmers. So this is a direct grant incentive. This is something that has to have rigor around it in terms of outcomes that are expected from these projects. We have seen a lot of uptake in terms of farmers understanding this is important to the government, this is important to our customers, this is important to our customers' customers. And so we've seen more interest in regenerative agriculture and smart farming, if you will, as a result of this program. Whether the farmers have received this money, most of them have not just yet. It's a fairly new program. But we see that interest with farmers coming to us and asking, how can we work with you? Can we work with you on these programs? And that's new. So we see that as not only financial, but also creating awareness and education.
Okay, and in that instance, those are grants, so there's a source of that funding that someone's decided that that's actually what we need to be doing. Okay. Okay, Rick, please.
So, question of incentives is central and complicated and we need to be specific in terms of who are we incenting. And I think the comments just made are helpful, and I would affiliate with all of them, especially this point about the need for smallholders to have access to even basic finance. It is essential. It's a kind of a prime mover to be able to invest in productivity. But let me just note that when you're talking about large-scale agriculture, sometimes just having the information through things like 100% traceability, as just announced by Governor of Pará as a near-term objective, can make a difference, because sometimes it's just a matter of having the right information so you can manage what you're now measuring. When it comes to agricultural productivity for smallholders, it's going to require a far more complicated and diverse toolkit. And some of that, I think, is in prospect and even in motion. As an example, taking the case of Brazil, President Biden announced his intent to make a $500 million contribution to the Amazon Fund over 5 years. The Amazon Fund, of course, is a performance-based mechanism to provide some of what's required here in terms of supporting everything needed for agricultural productivity, intensification, and generally supporting economically and socially what's needed to allow deforestation to be further reduced in Brazil. There is also an opportunity, and this is something that we've worked on directly with our Development Finance Corporation and BNDES, the Brazilian National Bank, to invest in things like land restoration on a commercial basis, but with conservation and economic benefits as a complement to more direct grant performance-based approaches like the Amazon Fund. And finally, and importantly, although it is not without its complexities and its timelines, there is a path to REDD+, high-integrity carbon markets through things like the LEAF program, and we are seeing Brazilian states and national governments taking concrete steps towards transactions under the LEAF program even today, and that is a really encouraging way to get to the scaled, sustained finance that's going to be required to manage through all of these challenges and opportunities for especially smallholder agriculture as a key driver of really managing deforestation reduction, managing land conversion challenges, and in a way that works socially, economically, and for smallholders as well as large agriculture.
Yeah, that's super, and I just want to flag that the utilization of the Development Finance Corporation is a really, I mean, that's super, right? Because that sits in between those two ends of the spectrum that I mentioned, from philanthropy to straight up commercial investment. Maybe we can come back to that in a moment. Eileen, do you have a comment you want to make on incentives, please?
Sure. I'm probably right that I'm the last to speak, because compared to the billions of government and the trillions of the private sector, philanthropy only works in millions, which means we have to kind of place our bets carefully. I think when I think about the incentive piece of this, there's a couple of things that we've talked about today that feel within reach within the tools that we've got, right? So bringing back degraded land, right? We've talked about some of the technical assistance that can be deployed, and I think some of the purchasing and other commitments that can make it economic for folks to make that transition. I think the other piece we haven't talked about as much today is surplus legal reserve, right, which is just a fancy way of saying the land that producers could legally deforest but need incentives in order to keep that in place. And I think that is where conservation financing tools come in. I think the other thing I want to say, we also believe in, taking some risks and being a bit experimental. And one of the things that we've been looking hard at is the notion of a 1% environmental service payment on commodity exports. In the scheme of things, that is not a lot. And for a consumer, it could be passed on to consumers, and maybe most importantly, it could be directed to smallholder producers in a way that actually unlocks money at a scale that could make a difference. And I think, as much as we can put together some things just through collaboration among folks that are at this table, I think, again, thinking about those who aren't, if we really want to unlock big dollars, I think we got to be willing to think out of the box.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what I like about this idea is that there's, as I said earlier, we always think about we need more money, but often it's hard to think about what's the source of that money, right? So I think this idea of the 1% levy is sort of sorry, you didn't call it a levy, you called it
environmental service payment.
Environmental service payment. Okay, so environmental service payment. It's a very direct link between that notion of here's the revenue source and this is what it's going to underwrite. And I think in most instances in the public policy world, having a dedicated source and having a dedicated use and linking those two things is generally a good move, right? So I want to maybe continue with this topic of incentives, but go back to something that you've mentioned earlier, Eileen, around policy coherence. So I think policy coherence essentially means let's not undermine one policy from one part of the government with a policy from the other side of the government. Again, asking all four of the panelists, does anybody want to touch upon that issue of policy coherence and how it plays out, or how it could play out, or an example of where you've seen it not playing out in a producer country associated with the production of agriculture? How do we think about that? Anybody want to take a stab at that? No takers? Okay, Allison, please.
I can talk about it from the point of view of a company that is sourcing in countries and exporting to other countries, but also creating commodities for consumption within the country in which we source. It can be very confusing. So if we are in an environment now where there's recognition of the need to forestall deforestation and preserve native vegetation, that's a good thing. But how are various countries going to be implementing their understanding of that and implementing requirements with respect to commodities coming into their borders? We would not want to create a two-tier system where there's one type of requirement for one country or group of countries that requires no deforestation, proof of that, all of which is well-intended, but other countries don't require that. And so other countries are creating a system where they might get and sell and buy at a lower cost the commodities that aren't meeting all of those requirements or don't have to show all of those requirements. That two-tier system is not good for our mutual objective, which is to, as urgently as possible, forestall climate change, but also deforestation and conversion of native vegetation. So there needs to be greater harmony so that we don't have two-tier or multiple-tier systems, so that there's a clear signal within countries where deforestation and native conversion is at risk, that these practices need to stop urgently. I think there also needs to be a clear market signal, and these two-tier systems make that very difficult. So if there's a signal that there is a greater price for deforestation and conversion-free products, that's a good thing, but what if it's less other places? So again, we've created these confusing signals to the market and to the farmer. That's the consequence of not having that kind of harmonization.
Yeah, great point there. And so Marcelo, why don't you go next, and then we'll go to Rick. And
Jack, I'm always afraid of regulations. We never know what is behind that. Usually, it's a good thing in principle, But in the end, when we look, it's an exclusion process. Okay, with all the respect of my European friends, the new EU directive, it's an exclusion regulation. I was invited as a Brazilian agribusiness guy to talk with the Germans there. And I made them one question, said, where are the guys from Bolivia, from Ghana, from Nicaragua, from New Caledonia? Are they coming here to talk with the German government as well? Of course not, because they're too small. So there are no room for them for discussion. You are just excluding those guys, and then you can go to bed with your mind clear and say, well, I'm doing the right thing because I am against deforestation. So to tackle deforestation, it's a matter of inclusion, not of exclusion. And the simple thing why we have that, because our mind system, our mindset is looking into carbon. So when you look at the Northern Hemisphere mindset, it's carbon, carbon, carbon. It's emission, emission, emission. So let's price carbon. Let's do something in regards to carbon. But we never talk about biodiversity. Carbon, it's a transition system. Biodiversity is a perennial system. So why we're not talking about biodiversity credits instead of carbon credits? Or why we're not talking about both of them? So I think it's a good pathway to start right now here in Dubai and run up to the Amazon COP. So how do we bring incentive to something that is good for the planet and is perennial? So forget about those personal regulations and let's look as a planet, what we can do as a planet. So let's stop to excluding people to make us feel good. So this is the point. We're excluding millions of people in countries. Like most of you guys from US or Europe, agriculture, it's what, 1, 2, 3% of your GDP? You have what, 2, 3% of your employees coming from the sector? In a country like Brazil, 28% of the GDP comes from agriculture. 20% of the employees are in the agriculture. So come on, guys. We must have a different system to look at regulations. I hate that, for sure.
Yeah, and I think this is, I mean, the interesting point on this is that we've been talking about this idea of a transition. And so what you're saying, Marcelo, is where we are in a transition right now is maybe we're excluding, and we need to be moving quickly as part of this transition to a way to include people in that process. And whether that's the cacao farmers or whether it's the cattle ranchers or whether it's people growing soya as well. So, Rick, comment on this, please.
Well, really just back to your original question, and very briefly to note that I just want to give an important and I think increasingly well-managed example of tensions and some incentives and policies that we have worked through, and specifically in the conversation around carbon markets and deforestation. Of course, when you take a purely project-based approach, you can have very significant issues with leakage and incoherence that comes from that. But the good news is that with REDD+ and with high-integrity jurisdictional approaches to providing appropriate sustained finance for countries like Brazil or Indonesia or DRC or others, Ghana, Costa Rica, you name it, that are really providing the jurisdictional investment and policy and tackling the problem at ultimately a national scale of reducing deforestation, then you have a mechanism that does have coherence and that does have appropriate incentives. And so I think that's a hopeful sign, and the progress we're going to see today on LEAF towards transactions is indicative of the fact that that market is beginning to really get in gear in a way that will, we think, provide a powerful basis for really the resources needed for countries to bring up the productivity of smallholders as part of what they're doing to manage intensification, and thereby actually with a sound economic and social footing, reduce deforestation over time and reduce land conversion in other biomes as well. And obviously on top of that comes the conversation we started with around things like traceability and zero conversion commitments for large agriculture, but they're related and different. And then finally, not to lose sight of the commercial investment opportunities in things like land restoration, which is a third pillar of what can be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, the idea of moving from the project-based financing with carbon to a jurisdictional approach is you sort of mandate coherence within that jurisdiction, whether it's a state, province, sub-district, whatever, or a full country. You're mandating the integration of the land use planning, of the business investment, of the command and control, if you will, over policies around what can and cannot be done. And you're sort of using that mechanism of a carbon payment to basically help transition the resource governance in that jurisdiction. So that's going to get us. So that's one way to move down that path towards greater coherence. Eileen, you raised the topic to begin with. What do you think about this?
I guess I just want to pick up on what Alice and Marcelo were talking about in terms of systems of exclusion creating these two-tiered problems, right? I think, in some ways what we can all agree on is, on the one hand, my understanding is that these two-tiered systems cost industry money, right? They're expensive to enforce. At the same time, the leakage and things that result mean that we don't quite get what we want for the planet either. So, but I guess I would say, while I hear you on your concerns on regulation, I still think policy has a pretty important role to play here. And if you think about what that cost is, can we think about working together to direct towards making sure that the negative subsidies are redirected towards positive things, to making sure that we have the enforcement where we need it? And I think that could make a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's key, right? Redirecting things to incentivize things we want and to maybe no longer incentivize things we no longer want. And I think there's a temporal issue there, right? Like at some point there were a lot of countries around the world that were incentivizing petrol, let's say, at the pump. And maybe now there's a changing notion as to what societies value, and maybe that incentive can be moved partially or fully into something else, which might have to do more on the conservation side of things or underwriting the agricultural transition. So I think what we're going to do now, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to see if there's anybody in the audience who has any question you might want to raise for our panelists. What I would suggest is you put up your hand, a mic will come to you. Let's try to limit the I have a comment and a question statement, which tends to be long on comment, short on question. So I would encourage you to keep questions short, and we will ensure that our panelists keep their answers also brief. So anybody with a question? Yes, sir. And please, if you could just identify yourself as well so everyone knows who you are.
Thank you so much. My name is Felix Kunda, and I'm coming from Zambia. This discussion is quite insightful, but where I'm coming from, deforestation is really a big issue. This is because the people there depend on natural resources. Things like cutting the trees for agriculture, cutting the trees for charcoal. Life revolves around natural resources, and it's very difficult for us to stop them from cutting the trees. Do you have any other initiative that can stop them from cutting the trees that they depend on?
Okay, so what I'm going to do is take a few questions. Thank you, Felix. So this is about what are the types of things we can do to sort of move people off that behavior onto something else. Other questions, we'll take a few and then we'll see who wants to take a crack at answering these. Yes, sir.
Thank you all. My name is Michael. I'm from the Good Food Institute. So as we've talked about, cattle and soy are the two main drivers of deforestation. Cattle for the land they live on, and soy, over 90% of which is used to feed animals. So animal production, which accounts for over half the world's habitable land and is set to double by 2050, is one of the main drivers, the biggest driver of deforestation. Luckily, there are alternatives. In March, the White House put out the Bold Goals for U.S. Biotechnology and Biomanufacturing report, which showed that new biotechnologies like cell cultivation and precision fermentation can create more protein for a growing world with actually less agricultural land. So the question I have is, and one of the recommendations from that report was for support of U.S. policies, including public-private partnerships, which unfortunately hasn't yet been implemented. So the question I have is, what more can we do to get policies like these that drive innovation forward and use new technologies to solve our land use problems across the finish line?
Okay. Great, thank you, Michael. So one more question. So you don't have to have a question. We can do another round in a second as well. So okay, so we've got two things. So Felix has raised. Pardon me. Excuse me.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Rasha from Iraq, DOC. As my company working in oil and gas, my question is that will be there any strict policies and terms, blah 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 for oil and gas industries in the future? Because as you know, it is affect directly on the environment. Thank you so much.
Okay, so that's a loaded question too. So we've got three questions. Anybody want to take a crack at the first one, that Felix has raised about the situation in Zambia, the second one that Michael has raised around policy, and this third one around oil and gas and subsidies and such. Yes, Rick, please.
So responding to the gentleman from Zambia with a very partial answer to a sweeping question, I do think that one thing we haven't talked about yet today, and I'm glad that you raised this, is the question of charcoal use as a driver of deforestation in some contexts. We've been spending a lot of time working in Democratic Republic of Congo of late on the question of deforestation and new climate economy for DRC. And one of the elements of the solution for a country like DRC, and it sounds like for Zambia as well, is to find alternatives to charcoal use, or at least to make sure that charcoal for cooking is used efficiently and improved cook stoves. But the alternatives are substantial and increasing. In the context of DRC, United Kingdom recently documented in a careful study that nearly all of the meals cooked in DRC can be appropriately cooked in electric pressure cookers. Electric pressure cookers can be powered with solar metrogrids. That's the kind of thing that philanthropy, in fact, is working to support through GIAP, the Global forgive me, People and Planet, I forget the exact acronym, in DRC, with funding from Bezos Earth Fund and Rockefeller Brothers behind it at scale. And they're seeing success in really deploying solar electrification in DRC, and that is one of the many ways that you can support communities adjacent to areas that are suffering deforestation, but also support an alternative to traditional charcoal use for cooking in a way that is really helpful financially to the households that benefit from that, but of course also has this benefit of reducing what in DRC at least is the second biggest driver of deforestation. Now on the broader question you raise of what about supporting farmers that need financing, basic financing, and other ways to invest in higher productivity. That's a broad development agenda that I think this panel, I think, has already addressed in some measure, but I think the question is welcome and the challenge is very critical, and we need to work in Zambia and DRC and many other contexts on all of these different elements. So thanks for the question.
Other thoughts? For Felix, for Michael, or the doctor in the back of the room, please.
I'll add a couple. I've talked a little bit about regenerative agriculture, which is a suite of practices that our company and many others with philanthropy support in particular are deploying around the world. And it's not just about sequestering carbon in soils and lower inputs and lower impact on the environment, which is obviously very important. It's also about greater resilience for farms and productivity for farms. And so we're talking about that with farmers around the world as well. And with greater resilience, with greater productivity or efficiency within a current footprint, the need to convert vegetation, the need to cut down trees is also reduced. So that's part of the incentives, if you will, helping farmers to understand those practices and the economic benefits of those practices as well. As far as innovation, I'm really glad you brought up that issue. ADM has been looking into precision fermentation and alternative proteins with a lot of bio-based knowledge and bio-based product that the company has. We're not seeing a lot of consumer awareness or consumer pull just yet. So I think that piece of the value chain really needs to get activated and educated about these products and the possibility of lower footprints and possibly even better health associated with these products, which I think is a place where we need research. Healthier soils leading to healthier plants, leading to healthier bodies. I think there needs to be more research there. But it's a very exciting field and one in which both philanthropy and governments could take a part and certainly funding. But there's a lot going on.
Other comments? Yes, Marcelo.
Well, thank you. We live in a beautiful and an ugly world. What a difference between these two questions, okay? The gentleman here is struggling to use charcoal to make the food, to cook their food, and the gentleman was asking about high-tech products. And it's crazy. There are solutions for both of them, okay? For the first question, we need philanthropy because we need to add and we need a blended finance system here because the philanthropy must arrive first for the proper initial infrastructure where the venture capital can come later and improve the system. So we have to find a way to put this in place. Biotech products, especially for proteins, there are some issues that are not solved yet. And when you look, there are 3 big studies on that from Kearney, from Deloitte, and from McKinsey. And it's funny because there are almost 1,000% difference in the size of the market among these 3 studies. So no one knows what's going to happen for simple reasons. The first one is a cultural process. Are you ready to eat lab meat? For some people it's okay. For most of the people, no, it's not okay. The second issue is religion. It's an issue. You got to ask our colleagues in India if they are ready to eat lab meat. The third one is regulation. So is your country ready to allow to switch natural proteins for biotech products? What we're talking here between your 2 questions is what part of the equation is linked to nature-based solution? What part of the equation to tackle climate change is linked to science and technological-based solution? So we are in between these 2 and how we're going to tackle that. And for the last question from the lady over there, I don't have an answer for you. I wish that in a short time, not 100 years old, shorter than that, oil is gone. Sorry for that. I hope so. I hope so. But right now, we are in a transition. And look at the Amazon Fund in Brazil. The Amazon Fund is mostly funded by oil companies. Most of the money comes from Norway. It's oil company. Okay? And just to finish here, Jack, we are running out of time. Jack told about financing and promises and commitments. That's nice, Rick. I'm looking forward for the 500 million US dollars. When we put together all the promises that we got to the Amazon Fund this year, from countries all over the world and companies and so on, do you know how much we got up to now, November? 3%. 3% out of the promise. So in order to put the question of these 2 guys together, we must make our promises reality. Otherwise, I see you next year in the next COP, and we're going to have the same conversation.
Thank you very much. Eileen, anything you'd like to say at the end here?
The only thing that I would add, the other thing that the gentleman from Zambia reminded us is bringing us back to Allison's pointing out that we really don't have anybody up on this stage representing the smallholders, the people in the community. So I think one thing we can do to be able to find better solutions is to make sure that we are creating those spaces. And I would say for the gentleman from the Good Food Institute, for us, we've invested in behavioral science because we believe that, these things are just as much deliberately shaped to begin with, and we can deliberately reshape them for good.
Well, thanks very much. And I just want to steal one of your terms, Eileen. I like this solution space idea. This conversation was meant to be around collaboration. And I think what it shows is that we do need places where we do have different voices coming in and raising different issues. I like, Marcelo, your comment about the fact that there is an oil company that basically funds the Amazon fund. It happens to be the state of Norway. So it's worth just noting that as with many things, we need more resources flowing into solutions. All of those resources have to come from a source. And we just want to make sure we're discerning about how we identify sources to pay for solutions, because we obviously need solutions here. So I'd like to thank the panelists, Eileen, Rick, Marcelo, and Allison. Thank you very much for your time and for struggling through the process of finding us here. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Thanks for coming out. Bye-bye.